This is the story of how a lie almost ended Clara Mae Thompson's life, and how a truth, spoken by a man who barely knew her, gave it back. It's a story about a woman who said "I do" at the altar of a dusty courtroom to avoid the noose, and the quiet cowboy who knew she was innocent long before the world did, maybe even before she truly knew it herself. He saw past the accusation, past the fear in her eyes, and saw the steel underneath. What followed wasn't a romance, not at first. It was a bargain struck in the shadow of the gallows. Her life for her labor. But on the harsh, beautiful plains of Montana, where survival is a daily prayer and trust is the only real currency, that bargain would be tested by a ghost from her past and forged into something stronger than any law or lie. This is a story about what it means to be truly free, and how sometimes the most binding vows are the ones that save us. If you believe that a person's worth isn't decided by the powerful, but by the grit in their own soul, then stay with us. See how a marriage of convenience, born of desperation, became a fortress of love. This is Clara's story. The air in the makeshift courtroom in Jasper Creek was thick with the smell of dust, stale sweat, and self-righteousness. It clung to the back of Clara's throat, a physical manifestation of the verdict that was already settling in the room like a shroud. She sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded primly in her lap, a posture of composure she had learned as a governess in the house of Mr. Alistair Finch. It was a useless gesture now. Composure was for ladies, and the town of Jasper Creek had already decided she was something else entirely. A thief, a liar, a woman deserving of the rope. Mr. Finch was on the stand, his voice smooth and oiled as the expensive pomade that slicked back his silvering hair. He was a pillar of the community, which meant he owned the bank, half the businesses on Main Street, and the opinions of most of the people in this room. He spoke with a practiced sorrow, a performance of a man grievously wounded by a trusted employee. "The brooch," he said, his gaze sweeping over the jury of grim-faced ranchers and shopkeepers, "was my late wife's, a family heirloom, priceless, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented." He paused, letting the weight of his feigned grief settle. To think that Miss Thompson, a young woman we welcomed into our home, whom we treated as one of our own, would repay our kindness with such a base and calculated betrayal. Clara felt a cold wave of nausea, treated as one of their own. It was a lie so profound it almost made her laugh. She had been their servant, seen but not heard, useful but not valued. She'd worked 16-hour days, tending to his spoiled children, mending their clothes, enduring Mrs. Finch's thinly veiled condescension, all for a pittance that barely allowed her to dream of a life of her own. She had been invisible until they needed someone to blame. The brooch had vanished the same week Finch's feckless son, Julian, had returned from Cheyenne with staggering gambling debts. But no one was looking at Julian. They were all looking at her. The poor, solitary governess with no family to speak for her, no one to vouch for her character. She was the perfect scapegoat. She was always quiet, Finch continued, his tone dripping with patronizing pity. Kept to herself. We thought it was modesty. Now I see it was cunning. Every word was a nail in her coffin. The townspeople murmured their agreement. They saw her quietness not as dignity, but as deceit. They saw her poverty not as circumstance, but as a motive. Her entire existence was being reframed as a prelude to this crime. The lawyer assigned to her, a young man more interested in not offending Mr. Finch than in mounting a defense, had offered a fumbling, half-hearted cross-examination that did more harm than good. Clara looked out at the faces in the crowd. Mrs. Gable from the general store, who used to slip her a piece of hard candy. Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, who had always tipped his hat to her. Their faces were closed, hard. They were strangers now. The rejection was absolute, a physical force that pressed the air from her lungs. She was 24 years old, and her life was over because a powerful man needed to protect his son's reputation. The judge, a man who played poker with Finch every Thursday night, cleared his throat. The verdict was a formality. Guilty. The sentence, given the value of the heirloom and the moral outrage Finch had so expertly stoked, was the harshest the law allowed. Death by hanging. A collective gasp, part horror and part grim satisfaction, rippled through the room. Clara felt nothing. A strange, hollow calm descended. This was it then, the final humiliation, to be erased by a lie. As the sheriff, a stout man named Miller with apologetic eyes, came to lead her away, a voice cut through the stunned silence. It was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together. "There's the bride's plea." All heads turned. The voice belonged to a man standing in the back of the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denims and a dusty hat that shadowed his face. He looked like he'd just ridden in off the range, which he likely had. Clara had seen him in town before, but never spoken to him. Silas Blackwood. He owned the High Valley Ranch, a sprawling, isolated piece of land north of town. He was a man known for his silence and his solitude. A widower, people whispered, who had locked himself away from the world. He stepped forward, his boots loud on the wooden floorboards. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He stopped before the judge's bench, his gaze not on the judge, but on Sheriff Miller. And then, on her. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, and they held no pity. They held an unnerving, assessing quality, as if he were judging livestock. "The old law," Blackwood said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A condemned woman can be spared the gallows if an honorable man takes her as his wife, assumes responsibility for her." The judge sputtered, looking to Finch, who was staring at Blackwood with pure venom. "That's an archaic statute, Mr. Blackwood, rarely invoked." "It's on the books," Silas stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He finally looked directly at Clara, and for the first time, she felt like someone was actually seeing her, not the thief they'd all invented. "I need a wife," he said, his voice dropping so only she, the sheriff, and the judge could hear. "My housekeeper quit. The place is too big for one man. You need to not hang." He let the words hang in the air, a proposal as stark and stripped down as the winter landscape on his ranch. "It's a simple arrangement. You'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly. You'll earn your keep. No more, no less. It's this, or the rope." The choice was no choice at all. It was a breath of air offered to a drowning woman. She looked from the hangman's noose that awaited her to the hard, unreadable face of this stranger. He wasn't offering kindness or love, or even belief in her innocence. He was offering a transaction, her life for her labor, a brutal, honest bargain. In a world that had just condemned her on a polished lie, that brutal honesty felt like the only solid thing she could grasp. She lifted her chin, her voice a little shaky but clear. "I accept." The words echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom. She had said yes, not to a marriage, but to survival. The sheriff unlocked her cuffs, and Silas Blackwood, Her new husband, by decree of a dusty law book, turned without another word and walked toward the door, expecting her to follow. And she did. She walked away from the gallows and toward a life she couldn't possibly imagine. Her heart a cold, hard knot of terror and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks. A desperate, defiant hope. The ride to High Valley Ranch was a study in silence. Silas Blackwood set a punishing pace, his big roan eating up the miles while Clara's much smaller mare, provided by the town livery as part of her meager worldly possessions, struggled to keep up. He didn't speak, didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply rode, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape of rolling hills and distant, blue-hazed mountains. The silence was a heavy blanket, broken only by the plodding of hooves and the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. Clara was grateful for it. She had no words for what had happened, no way to process the dizzying whiplash of being condemned to die, and then this, married to a stranger, bound for a home she'd never seen. The ranch, when they finally reached it hours later, was as stark and imposing as its owner. The house was a solid two-story structure made of dark, weathered timber, built to withstand the harsh Montana winters. It was flanked by a large barn, a series of corrals, and a handful of smaller outbuildings. The whole place was nestled in a wide valley, cradled by protective ridges but utterly isolated. There were no other homesteads in sight. The sense of remoteness was profound. This was a world unto itself. A man emerged from the barn as they rode in, wiping his hands on a rag. He was older than Silas, with a weathered face and shrewd, intelligent eyes. "Silas," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He nodded at Clara, his expression a mixture of curiosity and deep suspicion. "This her?" "This is Clara," Silas said, dismounting in one fluid motion. He didn't add, "my wife." He didn't need to. The news would have traveled faster than they did. "This is Jedediah, my foreman." Jed just grunted, his eyes lingering on her. Clara felt the familiar sting of judgment. To him, she wasn't a person. She was the condemned woman, the thief her husband had inexplicably saved. She slid off her horse, her muscles aching, and forced herself to meet his gaze. She wouldn't be cowed, not anymore. Silas gestured toward the house. "The kitchen's through there. You'll have the room at the top of the stairs, the one facing east." He said it all in that same flat, practical tone, an assignment of quarters, not a welcoming to a new home. And that was fine. That was the bargain. She walked into the house, leaving the two men to talk. The inside was clean but starkly masculine. Dark wood, worn leather chairs, a stone fireplace cold and empty. It felt less like a home and more like a barracks. There was no softness, no sign that a woman had ever lived there. Or at least, not for a very long time. The proving ground began the next morning before sunrise. Clara was not afraid of work. In Mr. Finch's house, she had been a ghost, her labor constant but unacknowledged. Here, the labor was visible, tangible, its results plain to see. She started in the kitchen, a disaster of unwashed dishes and dwindling supplies. By noon, it was scrubbed clean. A pot of bean soup was simmering on the stove, and she had taken a full inventory of the pantry. She found a neglected kitchen garden out back, choked with weeds. She spent the afternoon on her knees, pulling thistle and wild grass until her hands were raw, uncovering the faint, hopeful rows of last year's herbs and vegetables. Jed watched her. She could feel his eyes on her as she worked, his skepticism a palpable weight. He didn't offer help, just observed. A few days in, A crisis erupted in the barn. A young heifer was having a difficult first birth. The calf was stuck. Jed and Silas were working frantically, their faces grim. It was a bloody, desperate scene. Silas was about to give up, to make the hard choice to save the mother. "It's no use," he grunted, sweat pouring down his face. "The calf's lost." "Wait," Clara said, stepping forward. They both looked at her, surprised she was even there. "My father raised cattle. Let me try." Jed looked ready to scoff, but Silas, after a moment's hesitation, just nodded. "Do it." Clara took a deep breath, reached into the heifer, and felt for the calf's leg. Her hands were smaller, nimbler. She remembered her father's lessons, the feel of it, the precise way to turn the calf to free its shoulders. It was a struggle, her arm aching, the heifer groaning in pain. But then, with a final desperate pull, the calf slid free. It lay steaming and still on the hay-strewn floor for a terrifying second, and then it twitched, gasped, and let out a thin, reedy cry. The mother, exhausted, began to lick it clean. Clara stood up, covered in sweat and birth fluids, her body trembling with adrenaline. Jed stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Silas looked from the healthy calf to her, and for the first time, his expression held something other than detached assessment. It was respect, a small, grudging acknowledgement. He didn't say thank you. He just said, "Supper's in an hour," and turned back to the animals. But it was enough. It was a shift. From then on, the dynamic changed, subtly but surely. Jed started talking to her, asking her opinion on the chickens, showing her how to mend a fence line with tight, neat knots. She took over the ranch's books, which Silas had kept in a chaotic ledger. She found errors, identified suppliers who were overcharging them, and reorganized the accounts with meticulous care. She was no longer just the woman Silas had saved. She was a partner, indispensable. She was earning her place not with gratitude or subservience, but with competence. Each task mastered, each problem solved, was a brick in the foundation of her new life. She was building something here, in this remote valley with this silent, guarded man. She was building a home, and slowly, cautiously, the invisible woman who had left Jasper Creek was becoming someone else entirely. Someone strong, someone who belonged. The first snows of winter had just begun to dust the high peaks when the buggy appeared on the long road leading to the ranch. It was an elegant, polished black rig pulled by a pair of perfectly matched grays, a stark contrast to the rugged, practical wagons and working horses of High Valley. Clara's heart seized in her chest. She knew who it was before the driver even pulled the horses to a halt. Alistair Finch. He stepped down from the buggy, looking as out of place as a diamond on a dung heap, his city clothes immaculate, his face a mask of smug civility. Silas and Jed came out of the barn, their movements slow and deliberate. They stood on the porch beside Clara, a silent, unified front. Silas's presence was a solid wall at her back. "Finch," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "You're a long way from home." "Blackwood," Finch replied with a thin, unpleasant smile. He ignored Jed completely and fixed his gaze on Clara. "I've come to speak with Miss Thompson, or should I say Mrs. Blackwood, a shocking development to be sure." His tone was laced with condescending poison. "I confess I was worried for you, my dear. A woman of your delicate nature, thrown into this rustic existence. It hardly seems a suitable arrangement." "What do you want?" Clara asked, her voice steady. She would not let him see her fear. "I've been speaking with my lawyers," Finch said, his eyes glittering with malice. This bride's plea is a flimsy bit of legal folklore. A marriage conducted under such duress, without proper ceremony, it's hardly binding. A clever judge could have it annulled in a heartbeat, and then, of course, the original sentence would have to be fulfilled. The threat was plain. He was here to dismantle her life, to drag her back to the gallows she had so narrowly escaped. He was a man who could not tolerate being defied. Her survival was an affront to his power. Silas stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Finch and Clara. "She's my wife. The law's the law. You've got no business here." Finch's smile widened. "Oh, but I do. You see, I took the liberty of looking into your financial affairs. Your ranch is heavily mortgaged. The Jasper Creek Bank holds the note." He paused for effect. "And as you know, I sit on the board of that bank. A significant debt, coming due in the spring. A bad winter, a poor calf season. It would be a shame for you to lose everything over a matter of misplaced loyalty to a convicted thief." This was his true weapon. Not the law, but money. He was trying to squeeze Silas, to force him to choose between his home and her. He turned his full attention back to Clara, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There is another way, of course. A way for everyone to walk away from this unfortunate business with their dignity intact. All you have to do, Clara, is admit your guilt. Sign a confession. I would be persuaded to speak to the judge on your behalf. Perhaps a short prison term instead of the rope. You'd be free of this sham marriage, and Mr. Blackwood would be free of his debt. I would see to it." He was offering her a gilded cage, a way out that was really just another prison. He wanted her to break, to confess to a lie and validate his version of the world, where he was the righteous victim and she was the grateful sinner. Clara looked at the man who had destroyed her life, who now stood on her porch trying to buy her soul. She felt Silas's stillness beside her, Jed's watchful presence. This was her home. These were her people. The choice was not complicated. It was the easiest one she'd ever made. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. Finch's face tightened. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. She stepped out from behind Silas, meeting Finch's gaze head-on. "I will not sign a lie. This is my home now. That is my name. You have no power here, Mr. Finch. Not anymore." It was a declaration of war, a public refusal. She was choosing this hard, uncertain life with this quiet, difficult man over any false peace her tormentor could offer. Silas didn't say a word, but she saw the flicker of something in his gray eyes. Pride. He looked at Finch, his expression like granite. "You heard my wife," he said. "Get off my land." Finch, for the first time, looked truly thwarted. He stared at Clara, his mask of civility cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. He got back into his buggy, his movements stiff with anger, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unresolved menace hanging in the cold winter air. The tension of Finch's visit lingered long after his buggy had disappeared over the ridge. It was a poison that seeped into the quiet rhythm of the ranch. Supper was a silent affair, the air in the kitchen thick with unspoken thoughts. Jed, sensing the mood, excused himself to the barn as soon as he'd finished eating, leaving Clara and Silas alone at the big wooden table. The fire in the hearth crackled, a lonely sound in the cavernous room. Clara stood to clear the dishes, her hands trembling slightly. Finch's words had unearthed the terror she had worked so hard to bury, the threat of the noose, of losing this fragile piece she had built, felt terrifyingly real again. "He can't do it," Silas said suddenly, his voice rough. He was staring into the fire, his face etched with shadows. "He can't have the marriage annulled. The circuit judge signed off on it. It's legal." He was trying to reassure her, but his words felt hollow. They both knew a man with Finch's money and influence could bend the law to his will. "It's not the law I'm afraid of," Clara said softly, stacking the plates. "It's what he'll do to you. The mortgage. I don't want you to lose your home because of me." Silas looked up at her then, his gray eyes searching her face. "This is my home," he said, the emphasis clear. "My decision. My fight." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, snow-dusted valley. For a long time he was silent, a formidable silhouette against the night. Clara waited, sensing that something was shifting in him, that the walls he kept so carefully constructed were beginning to crack. "I had a wife before," he began, his back still to her. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, as if he were reciting a grocery list. "Her name was Ellen. We had a son, Samuel. He was 4 years old." Clara froze, her hands full of plates. She had heard the whispers in town, but hearing it from him was different. This was not gossip. It was a ghost. "It was a winter like this one is shaping up to be, hard and fast. The fever came on them both at the same time. I rode for the doctor in Jasper Creek, but the snow was too deep. The passes were blocked. It took me 2 days to get back. By the time I did," he stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Samuel died first. Ellen held on for another day. She just faded. I sat with her, held her hand, and then she was gone." He finally turned from the window, and in the dim firelight, Clara could see the raw, ancient grief carved into his features. It was a wound that had never healed. "I built this house for her," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "She wanted a big kitchen window, so she could see the valley. She planted that garden you found. After she was gone, I couldn't stand to look at it. I let it go to ruin. I let everything go." He wasn't looking for pity. He was just stating the facts of his life, the truth that explained his solitude, his silence, his refusal to connect with anyone. He had buried his heart in this valley with his wife and son, and he had been living in a tomb of his own making ever since. "I blamed myself," he said. "If I'd been faster, if I'd left earlier." Clara put the plates down and walked over to him. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him it wasn't his fault. Words were useless in the face of such a loss. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and took his hand. His hand was large and calloused from work, but it was trembling slightly. He looked down at their joined hands as if he'd never seen such a thing before. It was the first time they had touched for any reason other than necessity. It was not a gesture of passion, but of shared humanity, of seeing another's pain and choosing not to look away. He didn't pull back. He simply stood there, his hand in hers, and for the first time since she had arrived, the vast, lonely house felt a little less empty. The emotional fortress around Silas Blackwood had been breached, not by a grand assault, but by a quiet moment of shared vulnerability in the dead of a cold Montana night. Finch was a man who did not accept defeat. When his threats and financial pressure failed, he changed tactics. He became a man obsessed, not with justice, but with control. He hired investigators, men from out of state who asked quiet questions and spread money around. He was determined to break Clara, to prove he had been right about her all along. And in his vindictive quest, he stumbled upon the one thing that could undo him: the truth. It was a bitter irony. The real thief, as Clara had always suspected, was his own son. Julian Finch had pried the stones from his mother's brooch and sold them to pay a gambling marker in Cheyenne. The evidence was irrefutable, a signed affidavit from the jeweler who'd bought the gems. Finch arrived at High Valley Ranch a second time, but this time he was not alone. Sheriff Miller was with him, his face a mixture of embarrassment and duty. Finch looked older, diminished. The arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by a brittle, desperate anger. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. "The charges against you have been dropped," he announced, without preamble or apology. "A misunderstanding has been cleared up. My son has made a full confession." He couldn't bring himself to say the words, "I was wrong." He held out a document to Clara. "This is a full exoneration, signed by Judge Peterson. Your name is cleared. You are free." The word hung in the air. Free. It was what she had prayed for in that jail cell. But it sounded different now. Foreign. "There is, of course, a condition," Finch continued, his voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. "This has been a deeply embarrassing affair for my family, for the town. It would be best for everyone if you were to move on. I have arranged for a substantial sum of money to be deposited in your name at a bank in St. Louis, enough for you to start a new life, a respectable life. All you have to do is leave Montana. Disappear." It was the ultimate crisis of choice. He was offering her everything she once thought she wanted: her good name, financial security, the chance to walk into a town and not be judged. Respectability. The easy path. All she had to do was walk away from the one place she had ever felt she belonged. Walk away from the hard-won respect of Jed, from the rugged beauty of this valley, from the silent, complicated man who had saved her life and was just beginning to share his own. She looked at Silas. His face was a mask of stone, unreadable. He would not make this choice for her. He had offered her a bargain, and he would honor its end if she chose it. He was giving her the freedom to leave, the very thing Finch was trying to buy. This was her decision, and hers alone. She thought of her life before Jasper Creek, a life of being the dutiful, invisible daughter, then the dutiful, invisible governess. A life of living for the approval of others. A life that had led her to a courtroom, accused of a crime she didn't commit. What had that respectability ever gotten her? Then she thought of her life here. The ache in her muscles after a day of mending fences. The satisfaction of a pantry stocked for winter. The sight of a newborn calf taking its first wobbly steps. The quiet companionship of sitting by the fire with Silas. No words needed. It was a hard life, an unglamorous life. But it was real, and it was hers. She had built it with her own 2 hands. She turned back to Finch. The legal papers still held out to her like a temptation. She didn't take them. "My name is Clara Blackwood," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "And my home is here." She looked directly at Silas, a world of meaning passing between them in that one glance. "I'm not going anywhere." Sheriff Miller looked relieved. Finch looked as though she had slapped him. His face contorted in a brief, ugly flash of fury before settling back into a mask of weary defeat. He had played his last card and lost. He had offered her a clean slate, and she had chosen a life marked by scandal, A marriage born of necessity, because it was authentic. She had chosen the hard path, the true path. She had chosen love, even if they hadn't yet called it that. She had chosen herself. Finch crumpled the papers in his fist, turned on his heel, and walked away for the last time, a man undone by the very woman he had tried to erase. In the end, her freedom wasn't something he could give her or take away. It was something she had to claim. And she just had. The news of Julian Finch's confession and Clara's exoneration spread through Jasper Creek like a wildfire. It was followed quickly by the news that Alistair Finch, his reputation in tatters, had sold the bank and his businesses and was moving his family back east. The town was left reeling, forced to confront its own hasty, cruel judgment. There was a collective sense of shame, a quiet understanding that they had almost sent an innocent woman to her death. But shame was a private matter. Publicly, the story that lingered was the more romantic, more scandalous one. The gallows marriage. Clara was no longer the town thief, but she was now the subject of intense, whispering curiosity. A few weeks later, posters went up for the annual Founders' Day dance. It was the biggest social event of the year, a night when ranchers and townfolk came together in the big hall above the mercantile. Clara saw the poster in the general store and felt a familiar pang of anxiety. She imagined walking into that hall, the music stopping, every eye turning to stare at her and Silas. "We don't have to go," she said to him that evening. Silas was cleaning a rifle at the kitchen table, his movements precise and economical. He looked up at her, his gray eyes steady. "Why not?" "You know why. People will talk. They'll stare." "Let them," he said simply. He finished his task, stood up, and came over to where she stood by the stove. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I'm not ashamed of you, Clara, and I'm not ashamed of how we started. Are you?" His question was direct, leaving no room for evasion. She met his gaze. Was she ashamed? No. She was proud of the life they were building. She was proud of the woman she was becoming. "No," she said. "I'm not." "Good," he said. "Then we're going." The night of the dance, she put on the one good dress she owned, a simple blue calico she'd sewn herself. When she came downstairs, Silas was waiting. He had shed his dusty work clothes for a clean shirt and trousers. He looked handsome, formidable. He didn't say she looked beautiful, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, and that was more than enough. The ride into town was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than their first ride together. This was a comfortable silence, filled with a shared sense of purpose. When they walked into the dance hall, it was exactly as she had feared. The lively music from the fiddle and piano faltered, and then stopped altogether. Conversation died. 100 pairs of eyes turned to fix on them. The heat of their collective stare was a physical force. Clara's hand instinctively tightened on Silas's arm. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there for a moment, letting them look, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the doorway. He was making a statement without saying a word. "This is my wife. We are here. We belong." Then, ignoring the whispers and the stares, he led her toward the center of the empty dance floor. He put one hand on her waist and took her other hand in his. He nodded to the stunned musicians. "Play something," he commanded. Hesitantly, the fiddler started a slow, simple waltz. Silas pulled her into the first steps of the dance. He was not a graceful dancer. His movements were stiff, unpracticed, but he held her firmly, securely. They moved in a circle in the middle of the floor, the sole occupants of a world of watching eyes. Clara focused only on him, on the solid feel of his hand in hers, on the quiet intensity in his gray eyes. In that moment, there was no one else in the room. Then a sound broke the spell. It was clapping. Jed, standing by the wall with a mug of cider, was applauding them, a wide grin on his weathered face. Mrs. Gable from the general store joined in, and then the blacksmith. Soon, other couples, emboldened, moved onto the floor. The music swelled, the room filled with motion and chatter again, the moment of tension broken. Silas and Clara were no longer a spectacle. They were just part of the dance. They had faced the town's judgment together and had not flinched. It was their public declaration, a dance that said more than 1,000 words. Their marriage, born in a courtroom under threat of death, was now real. And as Silas held her, his grip sure and steady, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was finally, truly home. Years fell away like autumn leaves in the high valley. They passed not in days or weeks, but in seasons. The harsh, biting winters gave way to the muddy, hopeful springs, when the scent of rain on dry earth was the sweetest perfume in the world. The green, vibrant summers bled into the golden, crisp autumns, a time of harvest and preparation. Life was a cycle of hard work, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. They faced a drought one year that turned the pastures to brown dust and forced Silas to sell off half the herd. They weathered a blizzard the next that buried the ranch in 10 feet of snow, trapping them in the house for 2 weeks. They fought and worked and survived side by side. Their partnership, forged in desperation, tempered into a deep, abiding love. It was a quiet love, expressed not in poetry, but in a shared cup of coffee before dawn, in the way he'd mend a tool before she even knew it was broken, in the way she knew exactly how he liked his stew. The ghost of Alistair Finch faded completely. He was a story they no longer told. One day, a letter arrived with a St. Louis postmark. It was from Clara's younger sister, informing her that their father was gone, and their mother, humbled by time and loss, had expressed a wish to see her. Clara read the letter, a faint echo of an old sadness stirring within her. She wrote back a kind but brief reply, forgiving them for her own peace of mind, but making it clear that her life was here. Her family was no longer a matter of blood, but of choice. Her family was Silas and Jed, who was as much a grandfather to their children as a foreman. Their first child was a boy, Samuel, named for the son Silas had lost. He had his father's serious gray eyes and his mother's quiet determination. 2 years later, a daughter, Ellen, was born, with a wild laugh that filled the once silent house with light and joy. The ranch, once a monument to grief, was now a bustling, thriving homestead, its future stretching out before them, bright and full of promise. The kitchen window that Ellen had wanted, the one Silas couldn't bear to look through for so long, was now Clara's favorite spot. She would stand there, a child on her hip, and watch Silas and Jed working with the horses in the corral, the vast, beautiful valley spreading out behind them. She had found her place in the world, not by seeking approval or running from her past, but by standing her ground and building a life from the dust up. The peace they had was not a gift. It was an achievement, earned through every trial faced and every hardship overcome. It was a quiet, sturdy, and unshakable thing, as real and enduring as the mountains that cradled their home. One late summer afternoon, years after Finch had last troubled their lives, Clara sat on the porch swing, gently pushing it with one foot. The air was warm and smelled of pine and curing hay. Little Ellie was chasing butterflies in the yard, her laughter carrying on the breeze, while young Sam was down at the barn with Silas, helping his father mend a harness. The rhythmic creak of the swing was a peaceful, contented sound. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. They were no longer the soft, pale hands of a governess. They were capable, calloused, marked by years of gardening, baking, mending, and holding her children. They were the hands of a wife, a mother, a rancher. They were the hands that had built this life. Silas came up the porch steps, wiping grease from his own hands onto a rag. He sat beside her on the swing, his weight setting it into a slower, steadier rhythm. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching their daughter play, listening to the sounds of their life. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly, not needing to specify what it was. He knew. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "I think about that day in the courtroom. I saw you sitting there all alone. Everyone else was looking at a thief. I just saw a woman who was cornered, and I saw she wasn't going to break." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes full of a love that no longer needed to be guarded. "I told myself it was a practical decision, that I just needed help on the ranch. But that was a lie. I think I knew, even then, that I was the one who needed saving." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She thought about the word condemned. That's what they had called her, a condemned woman. And in a way, they had been right. She had been condemned, but not to the gallows. She had been condemned to a life that was not her own, a life of being small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of approval were tossed her way. The noose was just a rope, but the lie she had been living before, the belief that her worth was determined by others, had been a cage. Alistair Finch had tried to destroy her, but all he had done was set her free. He had pushed her to the very edge of existence, and it was there, on that precipice, that she had finally found the strength to choose her own path. Silas hadn't just saved her from hanging. He had given her a place, a reason to save herself. True freedom, she now knew, wasn't about being cleared of a crime. It was about choosing where you belong and who you belong with, and defending that choice with everything you have. It was the life in her hands, the man by her side, and the valley that held them all. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of. It was enough. It was everything.